If I told you to imagine the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Knights in shining armor, grand castles, maybe a heroic quest. We romanticize it, don't we? We think of it as a time of noble simplicity. But what if the real story of the medieval city, the beating heart of Europe, was a daily, stomach-churning horror show that makes the worst parts of modern urban living look like a spa retreat? Stop picturing a fairy tale. I want you to picture your morning commute. But instead of traffic and noise, the streets are running with a toxic, fecal sludge, the air is thick with the smell of death, and the very ground you walk on is saturated with centuries of human waste. You complain about your noisy upstairs neighbor or a bad food delivery, but your medieval counterpart was struggling with something far more primal: the terrifying, non-stop assault on their senses and their survival simply by existing in a city. The problem is that our modern world has completely scrubbed away the visceral, sensory reality of this period. We think of medieval times as simply old, but we don't grasp the utter toxicity of daily life. The aha moment we're going to hit today is this: the medieval city wasn't a historical setting. It was a lethal, beautifully designed death trap. And the systems we put in place today, sanitation, building codes, traffic laws, are direct, urgent responses to this forgotten horror. Let's pull back the curtain on the things historians whisper about, the non-plague horrors that actually defined the European medieval experience, and how they laid the groundwork for everything we value about modern urban living. 1. The Urban Cesspool, a city built on excrement. We think of sanitation as a utility, but in the Middle Ages, it was a philosophical concept that simply hadn't arrived. Your medieval city was, quite literally, built on human and animal waste. With no underground sewage systems, people used cesspits, essentially big holes in the ground, or simply threw their waste, known charmingly as night soil, directly out the window and into the streets. This was particularly true in densely packed cities like London or Paris. The city streets became open-air septic systems. When it rained, the roads didn't just get wet, they turned into a river of biohazard. Think about the smell of a forgotten, overflowing dumpster on a 100-degree summer day. Now, multiply that by 1,000 and realize that smell was the constant baseline of existence. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was lethal. The runoff contaminated shallow water wells, leading to constant outbreaks of dysentery and other fatal diseases even when the plague wasn't around. The gongfermors, or cesspit cleaners, were the most dangerous, shortest-lived job in the city, a true sign of the literal depth of the problem. The air itself was a killer. 2. The accidental firebomb. Building codes by conflagration walk through a quaint European old town today, and you might admire the charming, tightly packed timber frame houses. But in the medieval context, this tight construction was a civilization-ending risk. Buildings were often built shoulder to shoulder, with upper floors jutting out over the street, a practice called jetting. They were constructed primarily of wood and thatch, with open fires for heating and cooking. It was a perfect storm for disaster. A single stray ember could wipe out a quarter of a city in a matter of hours. The Great Fire of London, 1666, while late in the medieval period, is the perfect example of this unchecked vulnerability. Imagine that every house on your block is filled with highly flammable material, and your smoke alarm is a terrified neighbor screaming. There was no fire department, just a desperate bucket line. This constant, existential threat of an uncontrollable inferno meant living on edge. Insurance didn't exist. If your home burned, you were instantly homeless and destitute. The modern development of fire codes, required setbacks, and non-flammable building materials in the US and EU is a direct, hard-won victory against the medieval city's most common destroyer. The home was the hazard. 3. No escape from the noise and traffic jams of terror. We think modern cities are noisy, but imagine a city where every form of life and commerce occurred in the street, 24/7, with no acoustic barriers. Medieval cities were loud. Blacksmiths hammering iron, market vendors yelling their prices, pigs squealing, church bells ringing constantly, and the deafening noise of thousands of wooden cartwheels on cobblestones. This constant din, combined with the traffic, not of cars, but of literal livestock, carts, and thousands of people, made getting around a physical and mental ordeal. The worst part, however, was the medieval equivalent of a car crash, the deadly run-in with a cart or, worse, being crushed by falling debris. The narrow streets, designed to save space, became kill zones. If a rich man's heavily loaded cart ran over a pedestrian, the law often protected the driver. The earliest forms of city planning weren't about making things beautiful. They were about desperately trying to control the flow of lethal chaos. The modern concepts of zoning, noise ordinances, and pedestrian safety were born out of the sheer, unbearable sensory overload and danger of the medieval street. The street was a battlefield. 4. The shadow economy of the forgotten food. You know about starvation, but what about the horrific things people ate to avoid it, and what the authorities did to punish food fraud? Because food was so expensive and difficult to transport, local bakers and butchers were constantly looking for ways to cheat their customers. Bakers would mix sand, chalk, or even crushed beans into their flour to bulk up the loaf and maximize profit. Butchers would sell diseased or rotten meat, often disguised with heavy spices. This was a crime not just against health, but against the social contract. Think about that 100 loaf of bread we talked about. Now imagine that loaf is mostly dirt. The fear of being poisoned by your local baker was real. This led to strict, often theatrical, punishments. Bakers caught cheating might be dragged through the streets and forced to eat the rotten food, or even strapped into a cage and dunked repeatedly in the foul river. This practice, the cucking stool, was a public spectacle intended to enforce quality control. The assize of bread and ale, one of the earliest laws regulating commerce in England, shows how crucial and volatile food safety was. Trust in food was worth more than gold. The medieval city was a fascinating incubator of culture, art, and commerce, but only because its inhabitants possessed an almost unbelievable resilience against a daily barrage of filth, fire, noise, and disease. It wasn't the dragons or the bandits that killed most people. It was the invisible enemy that lurked in the water, the air, and the very structure of their homes. When you enjoy your clean water, clear street, and a fireproof home today, you are benefiting from the lessons learned through centuries of medieval misery. The peace and security of your modern life were built brick by painful brick upon the refuse of their terrifying reality. So, if you had to choose, live 1 year in a comfortable modern apartment with no internet, or 1 month in a 14th century Paris tenement, which would you pick? Let me know your answer, and why, in the comments below. And for those of you who found this deep dive into historical horror fascinating, you need to see the video we made on the forgotten history of the blackout meal, the food that saved Europe from starvation during World War II. Click right here to watch it. Subscribe now so you don't miss any more of the real history at your bites.